My parents and sister went on a trip to France while I was unconscious with a high fever. Please, take me to the hospital, I whispered. My mother laughed. We're leaving for France. Figure it out yourself, my sister smirked. Don't ruin our trip. Bye-bye. I lost consciousness shortly after. Days later, when they returned home, they rushed to me in a panic. My parents and sister went on a trip to France while I lay unconscious with a high fever. Please take me to the hospital, I whispered. My mother burst out laughing. We're off to France, figure it out yourself, my sister smirked. Don't ruin our trip. Bye-bye. I lost consciousness soon after. Days later, when they finally returned home, panic overtook them as they rushed into our once bright kitchen, now filled with the comforting aroma of apple pie. Olivia exhaled deeply, setting a pile of documents on the table. Across from her, her mother Helen flipped through a chic fashion magazine, still as stunning as ever, a reflection of the days when she had been a celebrated local beautician. Hey Olivia, what do you think of this red dress for Paris? Helen asked, holding up the magazine. Olivia looked up from her paperwork and forced a tired smile. It's lovely, Mom. She didn't have the energy to offer more, especially with a mountain of insurance renewal documents due the next day. Her father Charles ran a well-respected local agency known as Break Insurance, a reputation built largely on Olivia's hard work. After high school, although she dreamed of college, her father's plea led her to help run the family business. Now 16 years later. Oh, Lindsay, Helen called out, and Olivia glanced up again. Helen beamed at her smartphone screen. My Instagram followers are up again. It looks like that recent photo shoot paid off. That girl really has an eye for fashion. Olivia smiled silently. Lindsay had been in New York's fashion scene for 3 years, and her glamorous lifestyle was already making waves on social media. She was the only family member who had gone to college. When will you finish those documents? Charles's voice echoed from the living room. Though Olivia handled most of the behind-the-scenes work, Charles was the business's face. I'll be done soon, Dad. Definitely by tomorrow morning, Olivia replied weakly. She had been burning the midnight oil lately and wasn't feeling her best, but family duty had been ingrained in her since childhood. She remembered taking care of little Lindsay for a week when the 6-year-old suffered severe pneumonia, skipping sleep to nurse her back to health despite her own school obligations. Oh, Dad, look. Lindsay burst into the room as dinner was being prepared, her cheeks flushed with excitement. Her father looked up from his newspaper, grinning broadly. I finally got tickets to Paris Fashion Week. Lindsay's voice was filled with excitement. Since childhood, she had dreamed of attending Paris fashion shows. Congratulations, Lindsay. Her mother cheered, rushing over with joy. I've actually got 3 tickets, one for me, one for Dad, and one for Mom too. Cheers filled the living room as Lindsay spoke. Olivia watched her family's excitement from the kitchen and whispered, I wish I could go too. Did you say something? Her mother asked, turning around. I wish I could go as well, Olivia admitted shyly. A silence fell over the room until her father interjected. But someone needs to run the company, right? His tone was gentle but firm. That's right. It's crunch time for the policy renewals. The business can't run without you, her mother added, and Lindsay nodded in agreement. Besides, there are only 3 tickets. Sorry, Olivia. Olivia managed a weak smile. I understand. Have fun. That night, with just 2 days until departure, dinner buzzed with Paris talk while Olivia ate quietly. Her headache and sore throat worsened, and she suspected a cold. But she kept quiet, not wanting to dampen the family's excitement. After some pain medication, she went to bed early. The next morning, despite a persistent high fever, Olivia headed to work and finished the remaining documents. By evening, she was so dizzy she could barely stand. When she returned home, the family was in a flurry preparing for the trip. Olivia, what do you think of this dress? Lindsay asked, holding up a glamorous garment. Even though her vision was blurred by her headache, Olivia managed to smile. It's beautiful. She barely had enough energy for more. There's a stack of insurance documents that need to be done by tomorrow, and these important files need to be sent to a client in Paris, Lindsay added, shoving a pile of papers into Olivia's hands. Olivia nodded, though she swayed as she leaned against the wall. What's wrong? Her mother asked with brief concern. Just a cold, I think, Olivia replied weakly. Oh dear, hope you feel better by tomorrow. Have some herbal tea, her mother suggested before turning back to packing. Quietly, Olivia retreated to her room. No one noticed how her body burned with fever and severe chills. Although something felt very wrong, she quietly got into bed, unwilling to worry the others. The day before the trip, Olivia's condition deteriorated further. Her fever soared and each breath sent pain through her chest. Still, she managed to review the final documents for her father's company and prepare the materials Lindsay had mentioned. No one in the family, or maybe they pretended not to notice, saw how serious her condition was. Immersed in their excitement, Olivia painfully realized for the first time how much she was taken for granted. On the morning of the trip, Olivia struggled to get out of bed. Her head pounded like a hammer, and her body felt leaden. As soon as she rose, darkness clouded her vision and she had to lean against the wall. It's hard to breathe, she thought as sharp pain shot through her lungs. Making her way into the hallway, she heard her family's cheerful chatter, the sound of rolling suitcases, laughter, and the click of camera shutters. Slowly, Helen, checking a pastel blue suitcase, turned around. "Oh, you're up. You don't look well," she said, more impatient than concerned. Glancing at the clock, she noted that it was nearly time to leave. "Please take me to the hospital," Olivia managed, her hands trembling as sweat trickled down her forehead. Lindsay came down with her smartphone in hand. "Are you okay? Don't tell me it's the flu," she said with clear disdain, stepping back and producing a mask from her pocket. "My fever's high, I can't breathe." Olivia's words came out in broken fragments. At that moment, Charles appeared from the entrance. "The taxi's here. We need to hurry or we'll miss the plane." Initially, he didn't notice his daughter's condition. When he finally did, he looked confused. "Olivia, are you okay? Dad, hospital, please," she pleaded, reaching out weakly. Charles stepped toward her, but then the taxi's horn blared from outside. "Charles, it's time," Helen called, her voice anxious. She quickly gripped her suitcase. "We're leaving for France. It's impossible for you to come along." With those words, a cold smile crossed her face, as if justifying a mother's abandonment of her own child. Suddenly, Olivia's body collapsed, falling to her knees. Lindsay, irritated, declared, "Don't ruin our trip, bye-bye," as she wheeled her suitcase toward the door. Charles looked torn between his daughter and his wife, his expression one of confusion. "Olivia, there's medicine in the box on the top of the fridge. I'll take you to the doctor when we get back," he said. And with that, he too left the house. Olivia watched in disbelief as the front door closed behind them, the joyful voices of her family and the taxi's engine fading away. "Help me," she called weakly, her voice echoing on the living room floor. She reached for her cell phone on the table, but it was just out of reach. Every attempt to move sent sharp pain through her chest, and even breathing became a struggle. Curling up on the floor, she felt her consciousness slipping away while the room fell silent except for the cold tick of a clock. Her breathing grew rough and erratic, the light from outside stinging her eyes, and her head throbbed as if exploding. Faintly, the name Jessica, her longtime friend, escaped her lips. They were supposed to meet that weekend, if only Jessica could come sooner. And then, memories of caring for a feverish Lindsay as a child, baking a surprise cake for her mother's birthday, and staying up all night during her father's crisis flashed through her mind. With these memories, Olivia's consciousness sank completely into darkness, her body shivering on the living room floor as the window light shifted and shadows lengthened. 2 days later, in the quiet afternoon, a doorbell rang in the silent house. Soon after, the sound of a key turning echoed through the hall. "Olivia, are you here? We had plans and I was worried when you didn't answer your phone," said Jessica as she stepped into the living room. There she found Olivia still lying on the floor. Jessica screamed and rushed over. "Olivia, hang in there. I'm calling an ambulance." Olivia's skin was burning hot, and her breaths came shallow and irregular. The ambulance sirens, the rush onto a stretcher, and the blurred sounds of voices felt distant, as if underwater. Slowly, Olivia began to regain consciousness in a hospital room, staring up at a stark white ceiling. An 4-line was in her arm, an oxygen mask covering her face, and someone was speaking softly in a corner. At first, she couldn't quite make out what was being said. A doctor's voice spoke, warning, "There's a risk of fluid building up in your lungs if this keeps up. Let's continue the antibiotics and keep a close watch on your condition." The calm, female voice replying was Jessica's. Olivia tried to open her heavy eyelids, but they wouldn't budge as she wanted. Noticing, Jessica leaned in, relief washing over her face. "Thank goodness you're awake. You're going to be all right." Olivia attempted to speak, but only a hoarse sound emerged as she murmured, "My family." At that, Jessica's expression darkened. "They're still in France. I've been in touch with them," she said hesitantly. Olivia could sense the anger in her friend's tone. "Actually, I posted about you on social media. I'm sorry, but I thought what they did was just too cruel." Olivia weakly shook her head, confused by the term cruel, recalling only her family's callous farewell. Lindsay's icy remark, "Don't ruin our trip." "What post?" Olivia whispered. With reluctance, Jessica pulled out her smartphone and showed Olivia the screen. The post featured a photo of Olivia in a hospital bed with an oxygen mask, and hundreds of comments streamed in below. "I'm sorry, Olivia, but I thought everyone needed to know," Jessica said through tears. Olivia squeezed her friend's hand, nodding slightly even though her exhaustion and sadness overwhelmed her. "Everyone in town is furious," Jessica added. Olivia closed her eyes at those words. It hurt to think about her family. What were they doing in Paris right now? Did they even care about her? Just then, the door opened, and a woman with silver hair arranged in an elegant chignon entered. It was her grandmother, Elizabeth. Hurriedly, she approached Olivia's bedside and clasped her granddaughter's hand. "Jessica reached out to me, and I caught the next flight. I was so worried about you," Elizabeth said, tears glistening in her eyes. Olivia felt her own eyes fill with tears at her grandmother's kindness. "Thank you, Grandma." Elizabeth gently pressed her hand to Olivia's forehead and softly stroked her hair. "I tried calling Helen countless times but couldn't get through. That girl left you like this. Abandoned you while you were in dire need." Her voice, thick with both anger and sorrow, carried a mix of regret and disapproval as she recalled Helen's own troubled past. "When I was young, we struggled financially. I juggled 2 jobs and couldn't shower my own daughter with enough love. She grew up feeling alone. But that's no excuse for your mother to treat you this way. If anything, it should have made her determined never to let you feel that loneliness." Elizabeth sighed deeply. As Olivia listened, she began to understand a glimpse of the background behind her mother's coldness. Yet nothing could excuse what had happened this time. The low volume of a TV in the corner revealed a local news broadcast. The announcer's voice reported, "Shocking news, the president of Break Insurance and his family left for Paris, abandoning their gravely ill daughter." The post had sparked widespread criticism, and the story now dominated local news. "We've even heard that multiple customers have called to cancel their contracts," the reporter continued. Elizabeth reached for the remote and switched off the TV. "Don't worry about that now. Your recovery is what matters," she said softly. Olivia could only nod, her thoughts torn between her own pain and the damage to her father's business. Despite her suffering, she couldn't help but wish for her family's happiness. Meanwhile, Jessica's post had spread like wildfire, picked up by national news, fueling debates on family loyalty and the true meaning of love. Back in Paris, notifications began bombarding Lindsay's phone. At first, she assumed the messages were from friends, but soon it became clear that strangers were condemning her. "Mom, something terrible is happening," Lindsay said, her hands trembling as she showed her phone to Helen at a cafe after a fashion show. The color drained from Helen's face, and even Charles looked dismayed as he examined the screen. "Olivia's in the hospital," Charles's voice quavered as he dialed the office, only to be met by an answering machine filled with angry messages from customers canceling their contracts. "We need to go back immediately," Charles declared. With heavy hearts, Helen and Lindsay agreed. A few hours later, the Paris tickets were canceled, replaced by costly return flights to America. At the hospital, Olivia's condition gradually improved, her grandmother Elizabeth never leaving her side, and Jessica visiting as often as she could. "Olivia, you are such a wonderful person," Elizabeth said quietly, knitting by her bedside. "Your kindness and patience should have been celebrated. But things will change now. You must live your life for yourself." Tears welled in Olivia's eyes as she felt for the first time in years that her worth was being recognized. Soon, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the corridor as Charles, Helen, and Lindsay headed toward the nurse's station, their faces etched with exhaustion from jet lag and panic. Helen looked especially distraught, her usually impeccable hair now disheveled, and her makeup fading. "Which room is Olivia in?" Charles asked the receptionist in a trembling voice. "Room 304, but she has visitors right now," the nurse replied. The family rushed in and Charles knocked on the door. There was no response, so he slowly pushed it open. Inside, the room was quiet. Olivia lay in bed by the window with her oxygen mask on, while Elizabeth sat nearby, holding her hand. Elizabeth's eyes turned icy as she saw them enter. "So you finally come," she said, her voice sharp with anger. Olivia managed to open her eyes and look at her family. "Mother, we came back as soon as we heard you were in critical condition," Helen stammered. "Because of your delay coming back from Paris, Olivia has been in the hospital for 4 days," Elizabeth retorted, her tone low but trembling with barely contained fury. "You shouldn't have left her in the first place." Charles tried to approach, but Elizabeth raised a hand to stop him. "Do you 3 even understand what you've done?" she demanded. A heavy silence filled the room as Lindsay stood by the wall, tears threatening to spill. "Mother-in-law," Charles began, but Elizabeth continued. "Olivia suffered severe pneumonia and nearly lost her life. If Jessica hadn't come to see her, you'd have returned from Paris to face your daughter's lifeless body." At these words, Helen slumped into a chair, her face ashen, while Lindsay leaned against the wall sobbing. Only Charles remained standing, his eyes fixed on Olivia. "Olivia, I'm truly sorry," he managed to say, his voice breaking. Olivia stared at the ceiling, silent. "Our company," Charles faltered. "We've lost so many customers. Everyone's canceling their contracts. You said the business couldn't run without you, but now there may be nothing left." Despair laced his voice. Lindsay added in a small, trembling tone, "All my fashion work is gone, my social media following has plummeted, and all we're hearing is criticism." Lindsay covered her face with her hands as her shoulders shook in silent grief. "But you brought this upon yourselves," Elizabeth said calmly. "Do you remember when Lindsay had severe pneumonia at 13? Olivia, who was just 16, nursed a 6-year-old Lindsay for an entire week without sleep, even while juggling school. I received a call from your teacher saying you'd been absent that day because you stayed with Lindsay, giving her water and trying to lower her fever with cold towels." Lindsay looked up at Olivia with a mixture of surprise and sorrow. "I never knew. Of course I was just a child back then," But why did your parents always put all the responsibility on you? Elizabeth's eyes hardened as she fixed her gaze on Helen and Charles. And now you abandoned your daughter to go on a trip, even though she's battling pneumonia for the second time. Olivia's sister began crying, approaching the bed and gently taking Olivia's hand. Olivia, I'm so sorry. I just didn't understand how much you did for us. Olivia's voice, though hoarse, resonated deeply. I never wanted special treatment. I just wanted to be seen and respected as a person. Overwhelmed, Lindsay pressed Olivia's hand to her forehead, crying out, I don't understand, not at all. Charles knelt by his daughter's bed, his voice breaking as he said, Olivia, I've completely failed as a father. I took your dedication for granted. I won't ask you to forgive me. It's not something that can be easily forgiven. Tears filled his eyes as he stood there in regret. For the first time, vulnerability showed on the face of a man who had long seemed unbreakable. Helen rose from her chair and stood beside her husband and daughter, her eyes filled with emotions she'd kept hidden for years. In a soft, hesitant voice she admitted, I might have been jealous of you, Olivia. Everyone loved and relied on you. You had what I never did when I was young. Sometimes that made me mean. Olivia looked surprised by her mother's confession. This was the first time Helen had spoken honestly about her true feelings. But leaving you behind can never be excused, not as a mother or even as a person. It was the worst thing I ever did, Helen continued, her voice cracking as she covered her face with her hands. Lindsay moved to wrap an arm around her mother, and together, they gathered around Olivia's bed. From a short distance away, Elizabeth observed the scene, her stern expression softening ever so slightly. Olivia, she said quietly, whether you choose to forgive them is entirely up to you. But remember, forgiveness means acknowledging what happened, not pretending it never did. Olivia nodded slowly. Despite the lingering anger and sadness in her heart, the genuine remorse in her family sparked a small, fragile hope. 6 months later, under the deepening glow of autumn twilight, Olivia stood at the front door of her grandmother Elizabeth's house, sorting through the mail. Since her recovery, she had chosen to live with Elizabeth, enjoying peaceful days in a modest home filled with small, unexpected joys, like letters, mostly just bills and ads, which Elizabeth teased about from the living room. Olivia smiled and settled onto the sofa next to her grandmother. Her physical health had improved, and although the wounds in her heart were slow to heal, they were gradually mending. Meanwhile, her father Charles's insurance agency had shrunk dramatically. More than half of their clients had canceled, and rebuilding trust in the community would take time. Now he worked from a tiny office, running the business alone and reshaping its policies to prioritize honest management and customer care. Every Sunday, he made a point to visit Olivia, sometimes even consulting her on work matters. The confident air he once carried had been replaced by a humble sincerity. Lindsay had left the fashion industry behind to work as a volunteer at a local youth support center, channeling her passion into helping underprivileged teens struggling with family issues. Every Wednesday, she joined Olivia for lunch as they gradually rebuilt the broken bond between sisters. Lindsay had even mentioned to Elizabeth, I want to discuss Christmas plans. And though Christmas was still 2 months away, it marked the first time the whole family would be together since the painful incident. Helen, too, had undergone a significant transformation. She now attended regular counseling sessions to confront her own parenting issues and the lack of affection she had experienced in her youth. With courage, she finally admitted her envy toward Olivia and the distorted behavior that had resulted. Recently, she joined a local women's support group, sharing her struggles and learning from others. Slowly, mother and daughter began meeting once a month in neutral spaces over tea, their conversations sometimes quiet, but both committed to repairing their relationship. Suddenly, Elizabeth's phone rang. After a brief conversation, she turned back to Olivia. Your father is coming. By after work, she said softly. Olivia nodded, glancing out the window as a swirl of complex emotions churned within her. Though complete forgiveness would take time, her family's sincere efforts were beginning to open her heart. That evening, Charles arrived carrying a small package, a vintage wristwatch that once belonged to Olivia's maternal grandfather. This should have been yours as the eldest daughter, he said quietly, his eyes filled with regret. We should have recognized your value so much earlier. Olivia accepted the watch and read the engraved words on its back. Time reveals truth. A slight smile touched her lips. On Christmas Eve, the entire family gathered at Olivia and Elizabeth's home. A table laden with homemade dishes, a warm fire in the hearth, and small gifts and letters expressing heartfelt gratitude to Olivia set the scene. As she read the letters, quiet tears glistened in her eyes. Though the pain of the past still lingered, she found hope in this new version of her family. A hope nurtured by Elizabeth's wisdom and enduring love. Outside, snow began to fall softly, as if heralding not just the arrival of a new year, but also a new beginning.